If I have a chance to get the reality out there, I have a chance to show people what the truth is, and if they're willing to accept it, maybe that takes a little bit of hurt off my family.
These are the words of Scott Peterson, speaking from behind prison walls in August 2024. Nearly 20 years after he was convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Laci, and their unborn son, Connor. In a shocking turn of events, Peterson has broken his silence in Peacock's Face to Face with Scott Peterson docuseries, reigniting interest in one of the most infamous criminal cases of the 21st century. But let's rewind. On Christmas Eve 2002, in the quiet suburban streets of Modesto, California, a tragedy began to unfold that would captivate the nation for years to come. Laci Peterson, a 27-year-old expectant mother, vanished without a trace, leaving her family, friends, and an entire community desperate for answers. This is the story of Laci Peterson, the perfect couple. To understand the shockwaves that Laci's disappearance sent through her community, we need to first understand who Laci and Scott Peterson were and the life they had built together. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975 in Modesto, California. By all accounts, she was a vivacious, caring young woman with an infectious smile and a zest for life. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, described her as the light of our lives. Laci had a passion for teaching and was working towards her dream of becoming an elementary school teacher. Scott Peterson, born on October 24, 1972 in San Diego, California, was described by those who knew him as charming and ambitious. He'd grown up in a well-off family and had a seemingly bright future ahead of him. The couple met in 1994 while they were both students at California Polytechnic State University. Their relationship blossomed quickly, and they were married 3 years later in 1997. To the outside world, they seemed like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and full of promise. After their wedding, Scott and Laci settled in Modesto, California, Laci's hometown. They bought a quaint house on Covina Avenue, complete with a swimming pool in the backyard. Scott ran a sports bar before starting his own fertilizer company, while Laci worked as a substitute teacher. By 2002, the Petersons seemed to be living the American dream. They were financially stable, had a beautiful home, and were well-liked in their community. But the best was yet to come. Laci was pregnant with their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. Laci was overjoyed about her pregnancy. Friends and family described her as glowing, eagerly preparing for motherhood. She decorated the nursery, attended birthing classes, and shared her excitement with everyone around her. Scott, by all appearances, seemed equally thrilled about becoming a father. As Christmas 2002 approached, Laci was 8 months pregnant. The couple had plans for the holidays, including hosting family for dinner on Christmas Eve. Everything seemed perfect. But in a tragic twist of fate, this would be the last Christmas Eve Laci Peterson would ever see. The disappearance. The morning of December 24, 2002, started like any other day for the Petersons. According to Scott's account, he and Laci had breakfast together, sharing a bowl of cereal. Laci was planning to take their golden retriever, Mackenzie, for a walk, and then do some grocery shopping for their Christmas Eve dinner. Scott said he last saw Laci around 9:30 a.m. He told investigators that he was headed out for a fishing trip at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away. He claimed that when he left, Laci was mopping the floor and getting ready to walk the dog. When Scott returned home that evening, he said he found an empty house. Mackenzie was in the backyard with his leash on, but Laci was nowhere to be found. Her car was still in the driveway, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle in the house. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Concerned, Scott called Laci's parents and friends, but no one had seen or heard from her. As the hours ticked by and night fell, the worry grew. Finally, at 5:48 p.m., Laci's stepfather, Ron Gransky, called the police to report her missing. The initial search for Laci was intense. Family, friends, and community members combed the area, desperately hoping to find any clue to her whereabouts. The Modesto Police Department quickly became involved, and within days, the case had garnered national attention. But as the days turned into weeks with no sign of Laci, suspicion began to fall on Scott Peterson. His behavior in the wake of his wife's disappearance raised eyebrows. He seemed oddly detached, more concerned with his own image than finding his missing wife. He sold Laci's car, considered selling their house, and even looked into selling the boat he claimed to have used on his fishing trip the day Laci disappeared. Scott's composure during television interviews struck many as odd. While Laci's family appeared distraught, Scott often seemed calm and collected. This behavior, which some interpreted as a lack of concern, began to turn public opinion against him. As the new year dawned, the search for Laci continued, but hope was fading. Little did anyone know that the case was about to take a dramatic turn that would shock the nation and change everything. The investigation. As the search for Laci intensified, the Modesto Police Department found themselves under increasing pressure. The case had captured national attention, and everyone wanted answers. Detective Al Brocchini, one of the lead investigators on the case, later admitted that they focused on Scott Peterson from the very beginning. "When you have a missing person," Brocchini explained, "you always look at the people closest to them first. In this case, that was Scott." The police's suspicion of Scott grew as they uncovered inconsistencies in his story. For instance, Scott claimed he'd been fishing for sturgeon on Christmas Eve, but he couldn't tell investigators what type of bait he'd used. He also seemed unsure about the exact time he'd left for his fishing trip. But perhaps most damning was Scott's behavior. While Laci's family was organizing searches and holding candlelight vigils, Scott seemed oddly detached. He declined to take a polygraph test and hired a defense attorney early on, actions that raised red flags for investigators. As January wore on, the media frenzy around the case intensified. News vans camped outside the Peterson home, and Scott found himself under constant scrutiny. Every move he made, every expression on his face, was analyzed and reanalyzed by a public hungry for answers. Then, on January 24th, 2003, came the bombshell that would turn the case on its head. Amber Frey, a 28-year-old massage therapist from Fresno, came forward with a shocking revelation. She had been having an affair with Scott Peterson, and he had told her weeks before Laci's disappearance that he was a widower about to spend his first Christmas without his wife. The revelation of the affair sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. Suddenly, Scott Peterson wasn't just a grieving husband, he was a liar with a potential motive. The media frenzy reached fever pitch and public opinion began to turn sharply against him. Frey agreed to cooperate with the police, allowing them to record her phone conversations with Scott. These recordings would later become crucial evidence in the trial, revealing Scott's apparent lack of concern for his missing wife and unborn child. As winter turned to spring, the search for Laci continued, but hope was fading. Then, in April 2003, a grim discovery would bring the search to a tragic end and set the stage for one of the most high-profile murder trials in recent memory. The grim discovery. On April 13, 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci's disappearance, a grisly discovery was made on the shores of San Francisco Bay. A woman walking her dog stumbled upon the remains of a male fetus, washed up on the Richmond shoreline. The next day, about a mile away, the badly decomposed torso of a woman was found. The location of these discoveries was significant. The Berkeley Marina, where Scott claimed to have gone fishing on the day of Laci's disappearance, was just a few miles away. This geographical connection would soon become a crucial piece of evidence for the prosecution. On April 18th, DNA tests confirmed what many had feared. The remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The news devastated Laci's family and shocked the nation. For many, it was the final proof they needed of Scott's guilt. The condition of the bodies made it difficult for forensic experts to determine the exact cause of death or the precise time when Laci and Connor had died. However, the advanced state of decomposition was consistent with the bodies having been in the water since around the time of Laci's disappearance. With this grim discovery, the investigation shifted into high gear. On April 18th, just hours after the DNA results were announced, Scott Peterson was arrested in San Diego. He had drastically altered his appearance, dyeing his hair blonde and growing a goatee. He was carrying nearly $15,000 in cash, camping equipment, and his brother's driver's license. These circumstances of his arrest only fueled public suspicion. Why would an innocent man change his appearance and appear to be preparing to flee? For many, it seemed like the actions of a guilty man realizing the net was closing in. Scott was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for Connor. The prosecution announced they would be seeking the death penalty. As Scott was brought back to Stanislaus County in handcuffs, the stage was set for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in American history. The discovery of Laci and Connor's remains brought a tragic end to the search that had captivated the nation for months. But in many ways, it was just the beginning. The questions of how and why Laci and her unborn son had died were about to be played out in a courtroom drama that would rivet the nation and leave a lasting impact on the American justice system. The trial. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1, 2004, in Redwood City, California. The case had been moved from Modesto due to concerns about finding an impartial jury in the Petersons' hometown. From the very first day, it was clear this would be no ordinary trial. Media interest was intense. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but reporters packed the gallery and relayed every detail to a public hungry for information. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, many carrying signs proclaiming Scott's guilt. The prosecution, led by Rick DiStasso, painted a picture of Scott as a callous, calculating killer who had murdered his wife to escape the responsibilities of fatherhood and pursue a relationship with Amber Frey. They argued that Scott had used his fishing boat to dump Laci's body in San Francisco Bay, weighing it down with homemade concrete anchors. Key to the prosecution's case was establishing Scott's motive and opportunity. They highlighted his affair with Amber Frey, arguing that it provided a motive for murder. They also focused on Scott's fishing trip to San Francisco Bay on the day of Laci's disappearance, suggesting this was when he disposed of her body. The prosecution brought forward a parade of witnesses, including Scott and Laci's friends and family, police officers involved in the investigation, and forensic experts. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Amber Frey, who described her relationship with Scott and played recordings of their phone conversations after Laci's disappearance. The defense, led by Mark Garagos, faced an uphill battle. They argued that there was no physical evidence linking Scott to the crime and suggested that Laci had been kidnapped by unknown assailants, possibly in connection with a burglary that had occurred in the Petersons' neighborhood around the time of her disappearance. Garagos attempted to discredit the prosecution's timeline, bringing forward witnesses who claimed to have seen Laci alive after the time when Scott had allegedly killed her. He also argued that the media frenzy surrounding the case had unfairly prejudiced the public and, potentially, the jury against his client. One of the most contentious issues in the trial was the fetal age of Connor. The prosecution argued that Connor died on or around December 24th, consistent with their theory of when Laci was killed. However, the defense brought in experts who testified that Connor could have died days or even a week later, which would exonerate Scott. Throughout the trial, Scott's demeanor remained a topic of discussion. He often appeared emotionless, even during the most heart-wrenching testimony. This stoic behavior, which had raised suspicions during the investigation, now played out in front of the jury day after day. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this case was far from straightforward. The lack of direct evidence meant that jurors would have to piece together a narrative from circumstantial evidence and conflicting expert testimonies. After months of testimony and argument, the fate of Scott Peterson would finally be in the hands of the jury. Verdict and sentencing. After a trial that lasted more than 5 months, the case was finally handed over to the jury on November 3, 2004. The nation held its breath as deliberations began. Would there be justice for Laci and Connor, or would Scott Peterson walk free? The jury deliberations were not without drama. Less than a week into deliberations, the judge dismissed the jury foreman, replacing him with an alternate juror. This reset the clock on deliberations, which had to start over from the beginning with the new juror. Finally, on November 12, 2004, after 7 days of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, Judge Alfred A. DeLucchi read out the decision. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. The reaction was immediate and intense. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered as the verdict was announced. Laci's family wept with relief, while Scott remained stoic, showing little emotion as he had throughout the trial. But the case wasn't over yet. The jury still had to decide on Scott's sentence, life in prison or the death penalty. The penalty phase of the trial began on November 30th, 2004. During this phase, the prosecution brought forward Laci's family members to give victim impact statements. Their emotional testimonies painted a vivid picture of the devastation Laci's murder had wrought on their lives. The defense in turn called character witnesses who spoke about Scott's life before the murders, trying to humanize him in the eyes of the jury. On December 13, 2004, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Judge DeLucchi formally sentenced Scott Peterson to death by lethal injection on March 16, 2005. As he was led away to San Quentin State Prison's death row, Scott Peterson maintained his innocence, but for many, justice had been served. Laci and Connor's family finally had closure, and one of the most sensational trials in recent American history had come to an end. However, as we'll see, this was far from the end of the story. The case of Scott Peterson would continue to evolve, raising new questions and sparking fresh debates in the years to come. Appeals and developments. Following his conviction and death sentence, Scott Peterson's case entered a new phase, the appeals process. This is standard procedure in death penalty cases, but in Peterson's case, it would lead to some surprising developments. Peterson's attorneys filed their first appeal in 2012, arguing that there had been numerous errors in the original trial. They claimed that the intense media coverage had made it impossible for Peterson to receive a fair trial.
Convicted killer Scott Peterson is appealing his death sentence for the murder of his wife. Peterson's attorney filing the appeal this week. Back in 2004, Peterson was sentenced to death after a jury found him guilty of killing his wife, Laci, and dumping her body in the San Francisco Bay. In the appeal, Peterson's lawyer argues that he was convicted and sentenced to death, even though investigators never directly proved how, where, or when the murder occurred.
The judge had made mistakes in jury selection and in admitting certain evidence. For years, these appeals seemed to be going nowhere. But in August 2020, nearly 16 years after Peterson's conviction, there was a stunning development. The California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence, citing significant errors in jury selection during the penalty phase of his trial. The court found that the trial judge had improperly dismissed jurors who said they personally disagreed with the death penalty, without first determining whether they could still follow the law and impose it if the evidence warranted. However, while this decision overturned Peterson's death sentence, it did not overturn his conviction. The court upheld the guilty verdicts for the murders of Laci and Connor. This decision meant that if prosecutors wanted to keep Peterson on death row, they would need to retry the penalty phase of his trial. Otherwise, he would be resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the wake of this decision, Peterson's case attracted renewed attention. His supporters, who had always maintained his innocence, saw this as an opportunity to push for a full retrial. They argued that if there were errors in jury selection for the penalty phase, there might have been similar issues in the guilt phase of the trial. Adding to the renewed interest in the case, in January 2021, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced that they were taking on Scott Peterson's case. This organization, known for its work in exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals, stated that they believed there was evidence that hadn't been properly examined during the original trial. The involvement of the Innocence Project brought new scrutiny to the evidence in the case. They raised questions about potential alternate suspects, including burglars who had been active in the Petersons' neighborhood around the time of Laci's disappearance. They also sought to re-examine forensic evidence, including DNA testing on items found with Laci's body. These developments reignited public debate about the case. For some, it was a sign that justice might have miscarried and that Peterson deserved a new trial. For others, it was a painful reopening of old wounds, forcing Laci's family to relive their tragedy in the public eye once again. As the appeals process continued, Peterson remained in prison. In December 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, officially removing him from death row. This resentencing didn't change his conviction, but it did mean that Peterson would no longer face execution. The ongoing legal battles and the involvement of the Innocence Project ensured that the Laci Peterson case remained in the public eye, nearly 2 decades after the crime occurred. It served as a reminder of the complexities of the American justice system and the enduring impact of high-profile cases on public consciousness. Scott Peterson speaks 20 years later. In a surprising turn of events, Scott Peterson broke his silence in August 2024, granting his first extensive interview since his conviction. This rare glimpse into Peterson's perspective came as part of a 3-part docuseries titled Face to Face with Scott Peterson, which aired on a major streaming platform. During Peacock's Face to Face with Scott Peterson docuseries, which premiered on Tuesday, August 20th, Scott, 51, was interviewed from prison by director Shireen Anderson about the high-profile case. Scott's tell-all is the first time the convicted killer broke his silence in the 20 years since he was found guilty for his wife and unborn child's deaths.
If I have a chance to get the reality out there, I have a chance to show people what the truth is, and if they're willing to accept it, maybe that takes a little bit of hurt off my family.
Scott said about his motivation for speaking out. That would be the biggest thing that I can accomplish right now. Scott urged those watching the 3-part doc not to trust him, but to look at the evidence instead. With Scott Peterson subsequently laid out the timeline of Laci's disappearance, while questioning what details potentially weren't examined properly by the Modesto Police Department at the time. Scott started the docu-series out by walking viewers through the night that Laci went missing. When I got home, I started to call her friends, and they hadn't spoken to her. They didn't know where she was, and as the hours progressed, it was like, oh my God, she's out somewhere that we know of, he recalled. So it was anxiety and panic. According to Scott, the police gave him the impression that they didn't trust his side of the story that same night. When former detective of Modesto PD Al Brocchini took a walk around the house, I don't think they knew I was near them. One of them said, "Oh yeah, we know what is going on here, it's the husband." Then they realized I was there, he claimed. Brocchini's questions weren't questions. They were accusations. He had made up his mind before he had even arrived at our home. Brocchini, who was also interviewed for the docu-series, spoke about the inconsistencies that made him think Scott was hiding crucial details about Laci's disappearance. The detective specifically cited Scott's lack of concern in the first few hours, when his wife couldn't be located, as something that led them to keep an eye on him. It's so hard to explain what was going on. It was so out of any experience anyone could ever have to have. Scott fired back about his composed demeanor while being questioned. I was trying to keep it together, trying to get the search started and trying to deal with the police. There was no time to fall apart. I couldn't have that happen. The things that I relish from the day Laci went missing are things like seeing Laci's smile when she was doing her hair on the morning of the 24th, Scott noted. The way we shared a bowl of her cereal because we were too lazy to get 2 bowls. Just those little things are still with me. In the first episode of the doc, Scott was asked about a voicemail he left for Laci before he returned home the day of her disappearance. Scott defended the loving message after authorities speculated that he was faking it because he knew it would be heard later in the investigation. That was common for us. She would call me cutie and I would call her beautiful. We loved one another, we enjoyed one another, and we were great friends. They implied it was too sweet of a message for a married couple or something, he said on screen. They have really sad marriages if they think that. I feel bad for them. Scott maintained that he didn't initially think anything was wrong when he came home and Laci was gone. I just thought Laci's with her friends or she's at her mom's house, which would not be uncommon. Then when I found out Laci wasn't at her mother's house, I started to get concerned, he explained. I know there is this narrative that I wasn't concerned about, but there were so many times where I was on the edge and just trying to hang on. I was surprised to read that in their reports, and it is all falsely reported about my mood. Scott added, they are saying that because I was unwilling for the first few weeks to go in front of a camera and give them the terrible emotions I was feeling. 2 days after Laci was reported missing, the police got permission to search Scott's home and warehouse. Scott wasn't thrilled at the lack of trust from the authorities, which was considered a red flag by the police. It was so clear what was happening. They had this assumption, I think it is called confirmation bias, where they look for evidence that supports their bias. And that's what they did. Detective Brocchini specifically told the teams what he thought happened and what he wanted to find, Scott claimed. They came into our house not to look for Laci, but to look for evidence against me. They did a search of our house with absolutely no forensic evidence. There's no blood or struggle. Nothing like that. Yet they continue to focus on me. The Modesto Police Department mentioned finding evidence at Scott's warehouse of 5 homemade anchors, 4 of which weren't recovered. Scott waved off the theory that he used 4 of them to weigh down Laci's body when he allegedly dropped her body in the marina. 1 month before Laci disappeared, Scott started secretly dating Frey after being introduced by mutual friends. Frey got in contact with the police when she saw coverage about Laci in the news, and their affair led investigators to a potential motive once Laci's remains were found in 2003. That's so offensive and so disgusting. I just don't get that argument, and it's absolutely not true. I certainly regret cheating on Laci, Scott shared in Peacock's special. It is about being childish and lacking self-esteem and selfishness. It was me traveling somewhere and being lonely because I wasn't at home. Then someone makes you feel good because they want to have sex with you. That's what it was to me. Scott defended his decision to remain in contact with Frey, even after Laci went missing. According to Scott, he intentionally spoke with Amber so she wouldn't go public with their relationship, which he thought would cause the police to stop searching for Laci. The search for Laci would stop as soon as the public and police know I was having sex with another woman, he claimed. It simply wasn't a relationship. That's a misconception, and I was absolutely wrong. It is a horrible truth. There are thoughts that haunt me. It's devastating. I feel such shame and guilt that me having sex with Amber Frey did all that. That they didn't look for Laci alive. I wasn't the last one to see Laci that day. There are so many credible witnesses who saw her walking in our neighborhood, Scott noted. I recently learned that in one of the reports, a person came down to talk to the police and they were told, "No, you are wrong. You didn't see her." They just dismissed him without looking into it. That's devastating to learn that kind of stuff. With Scott Peterson featured interviews with several people from the neighborhood who all claimed they saw Laci walking her dog the morning she went missing. They were all surprised the police didn't follow up with them since their testimonies meant Laci was still alive that morning and was headed away from the home she shared with Scott. I had people spit on me at gas stations. I received death threats on the phone, Scott recalled about being considered the prime suspect before his arrest. I had someone in the front yard claiming they were a witch and burying things. I wish I could say I was stronger, but all that stuff did take a toll on me. Scott discussed being on no sleep, as he was desperate to keep the search for Laci and their unborn child going. He was subsequently asked about the day Laci and his son's remains were missing in the marina. There had been a report that a body had been found on the shore in the bay. We thought because there wasn't an announcement, it wasn't her, he admitted. It wasn't a thought. During an interview with Anderson, Scott broke down the timeline of the police arresting him after they followed his car for hours. When my family was having rough times, we always did something. We'd go play golf or we would go fishing off of San Diego. That's how we relate. That's how we've always gotten together. We never talked about the rough times. We'd just go do things together. It may seem odd to other people, but we're not guys who talk, he explained. That day, I was headed to Torrey Pines golf course to play golf with my brothers and my dad. We just wanted to get together that day and be together. Scott got on the road and thought he was being followed by reporters. As a result, he started to drive faster, thinking he was getting away from strangers and not the police. I was never running from the police. I was always in contact with them. I answered most of their calls, but there were times I was very frustrated and would not take their calls, he said about the various rumors regarding his arrest. The reason I dyed my hair is because I was getting death threats. I had my brother's driver's license with me to get a discount to play golf. It is much cheaper for someone who lives in the county. The results that confirmed Laci was the body found on the shore were released shortly after Scott's arrest. He didn't have an overtly emotional response, which law enforcement also cited as an example of why they considered that he knew what happened to Laci. I didn't think it was them. When they told me, I had just a terrible physical reaction, a really emotional physical reaction, he told the director of the dock. But I was in a car with 2 detectives. Really didn't believe the police so much when they told me. Part of me said, no, that's not possible. Scott didn't testify during the 2004 trial, in which he was found guilty for the murder of Laci and his unborn son. Looking back now, Scott admitted he would have approached the legal situation differently since his future was on the line. I would not waive time on my trial. I look back at that now and I wonder if that was the right decision. I have the evidence in my innocence, and it was a nightmare being stuck in county jail. I just wanted to show it as soon as possible, he detailed. Now I look back at some of the things we've learned, some of the things we were still learning during trial. I wonder if I had been more prudent or patient. Maybe things would have been different? Despite the evidence presented to the jury, Scott didn't think he would be found guilty. I was totally expecting to go home that day. It was like this horrible physical reaction that I had. Everything just went kind of silent. I couldn't feel anything, he continued. I couldn't feel my feet on the floor. I couldn't feel the chair I was sitting in. My vision was even a little blurry. And I just had this weird sensation that I was falling forward. I was staggered by it. I had no idea it was coming. Throughout Face-to-Face with Scott Peterson, multiple people that were interviewed pointed out how Scott and Laci's neighbors were burglarized in the days she went missing. 2 men were subsequently arrested, but they only admitted to guilt related to the robbery, and not Laci's disappearance. You know, there was a burglary across the street from our home. There were a lot of people in that burglary, Scott mentioned during the final part of the docu-series, and I believe that Laci went over there to see what was going on. And that's when she was taken. Scott and his family members remain convinced that Laci's murder and the burglaries were connected. At the volunteer center, people were coming in, and some wanted to go search while some came in with tips, Scott claimed. I passed it on to the police because I wanted them to follow up, and I thought they were following up on it. I found out later that they weren't following up on anything. In addition to the burglary, Scott's defense mentioned a burned van that was found near their neighborhood, and a person who claimed they saw a pregnant woman being forced into a van. There was also a watch that could have belonged to Laci that ended up at a pawn shop, and testimony from a correctional officer who alleged he heard phone conversations between prisoners that mentioned the robbers crossing paths with Laci. People wanted the answer they believed to continue to be the answer. We are all slow to admit we are wrong, Scott said in the 3rd part of the doc, before claiming that even Laci's body being found in the marina traced back to the police having it out for him. Someone expressed it to me. The police just told everyone where you were. They just gave everyone a way to implicate you by telling them where to dump Laci's body. The detectives involved in the case shut down Scott's theories by pointing out that the watch was never linked to Laci. The officer who gave a statement later allegedly recanted it, and that they looked into every tip given to them. Scott's defense team tried to get DNA testing on a variety of objects, but the judge denied everything except the tape found on Laci's body. Face to face with Scott Peterson, wrapped up with Scott reflecting on the memories he has of his time with Laci. Every moment is so real, so tactile, and still there, the smells and the light and the sound, and when I said goodbye to Laci. And then my family was gone. I drove away expecting to come back that afternoon and have a wonderful Christmas together after we both had fun mornings, he said. And they were gone, and it's still very present. But there are certainly times that I become a wreck. Excuse me, I'm trying not to be too emotional while I'm out here in the main room of the prison. This late-breaking development in the case served to reignite public interest and debate, demonstrating the enduring fascination with the Laci Peterson case even 2 decades later. Unresolved mystery. As we come to the end of our examination of the Laci Peterson case, we're left with more questions than answers. Was justice truly served? Did Scott Peterson receive a fair trial? Or was he convicted in the court of public opinion long before the jury reached its verdict? The current status of the case remains complex. Scott Peterson continues to serve his life sentence, maintaining his innocence. His legal team, supported by the Innocence Project, continues to fight for a new trial, though the path forward is uncertain and likely to be long and difficult. This case serves as a stark reminder of the challenges inherent in our justice system, particularly when it comes to cases built largely on circumstantial evidence. It raises important questions about the impact of media coverage on high-profile trials and the sometimes blurry line between guilt and innocence in the court of public opinion. As Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, wrote in her book, For Laci, "I can't accept what happened to Laci. I just can't. There's nothing as devastating as the death of a child, and there's nothing as unacceptable as what happened to her. Together, the two are an unimaginable horror." These words cut to the heart of why this case continues to resonate with so many people. It's not just about the legal arguments or the evidence. It's about the profound human tragedy at the center of it all. For those of you who have followed this case over the years, I encourage you to share your thoughts. What aspects of the case do you find most compelling or troubling? How has your perspective on the case changed over time? And for those who are new to this story, I hope this overview has provided a balanced and thoughtful introduction to a case that continues to captivate and confound. As always, I encourage you to dig deeper, to question everything, and to approach these complex issues with an open mind. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to ScareShare for more in-depth true crime stories that challenge what you think you know.